But I think also he's a warrior of the cause of truth. He was not only there researching the archives on these issues that today are so important to resolve, by doing this in the 1970s, 80s, but he was also there to look at the intent and the psychological state of terrorists, of the Asala and the JCAG terrorist groups. And he was an expert witness at the trials in France, particularly of the Orly trial, where Armenian terrorists, I believe, Asala, set off a bomb and killed dozens of people at the airport there. He worked under extremely difficult conditions, which meant no one would know where he was while he was in Paris. They would always have to change his routes so that he wouldn't be followed, to be killed. He had to change vehicles all the time because that was their mode of operation, to explode new vehicles. He lost many friends, and but he was so enthusiastic about getting the truth out that was his passion. And on Saturday night, I forgot to mention this program. On Saturday night we had a fundraiser, and we honored Professor Ataov at the fundraiser with a plaque of excellence in humanity. And Professor Ataov made everyone tear. He said, you know, I've gotten knighthood from this country, knighthood from that country, and he said, this is the first time I'm getting recognized by my own people. And then he gave me, but gave the ATA a very important gift, an Ataturk pendant from his necktie. So, Professor Ataov, words cannot sufficiently explain how much you mean to us. We love you. We are with you all the time. Please educate us, make us see things that we have not been able to see. And may God be with you, and may the forces of the universe be with you.
That's a good talker.
So,
since he was talking to you standing here, I'd rather stand, as long as I can continue doing that.
If you could sit, we can record much better. Otherwise, it's very shaky. Yes.
All right. Now, please do not expect me to give another summary of the Armenian issue. I can't do that, and nobody can. The time is very short, and it's a long and complex historical issue. But I'd rather concentrate on the topic of a book of mine that I just finished. And one of the reasons for my coming to this country is to search for a printer willing and able and courageous enough to publish it. And I will dwell only on certain documents, about 242 documents of a very important Armenian leader. He is Bogos Nubar, and he was appointed as the president of the Armenian national delegation by the Catholicos at Echmiadzin in the Caucasus. So he was selected for this purpose, and he continued in this job or responsibility for a number of years. He wasn't successful at the end, but he did his best. Of course, he was entirely one-sided. And the person who appointed him to this job in the year 1912 was Kevork V. He was the supreme leader of all Armenians, and he officially presented as follows: Kevork, servant of Jesus Christ, and by the unassailable will of God, Archbishop, Bishop, and Catholicos of all Armenians, Supreme Patriarch of the Apostolic Araratian Primary National Church at Holy Echmiadzin, most reverend primate of Armenia. It's a very impressive description, isn't it? So he was the man who selected Bogos Nubar, and Bogos Nubar met several people in a number of European capitals and habitually sent reports to him. And he took down the minutes of his contacts, and he wrote letters to a number of European dignitaries, and he pleaded to some allied diplomats and commanders and for some kind of coordinated attack on the Turks, and he sent orders to his subordinates and so on. Now, I looked through these documents, and to me, they looked as if they are, in a way, confessions, because there are certain things in which he writes, that changes the picture drawn by militant Armenians nowadays. Of course, he probably thought that what he wrote would remain a secret or top secret, but nothing can remain top secret for a very long time. Everything sooner or later becomes quite known. So he tried to carve out a very large Armenia from the Turkish lands, and he wanted to get the support of the French, Russians, the British, the United States for a mandate or a protectorate, and initially to be led by a Russian prince or a British prince or under French protection. And so the kind of things that he wrote contradicts the propaganda that we hear. On one side, of propaganda of the Armenians in our days. Now, I've established that having been, of course he was born in Istanbul, but having had his education mostly in France, and knowing French rather well, and he would have an apartment somewhere in Paris, and that is number 12 on Avenue Tracodora, and he paid visits to London and to some other European capitals. He wrote letters, for instance, to the Italian king, and of course he was in touch with some Russians in Petrograd, and so on. And he even wrote clandestinely to the Armenian Archbishop in Istanbul. And well, who was this man? He was born in 1851 and died in 1930. Was born in Istanbul and attended school in Paris, École Centrale, and he remained the sole representative of the Echmiadzin Church. Of course, some people didn't like him, I mean, among the Armenians in the Caucasus, and they tried to bring him down, or they suggested certain other candidates as members of his assisting group and so on. But the Catholicos in Echmiadzin did not change his original decision, and he, throughout the war years especially, he was their representative. Now, of course, his place of propaganda was, of course, Europe and the Western world. Well, he was in the right place, if you ask me, in those days, because First of all, the Westerners had very little knowledge about the Turks and about Islam and so on. And of course, we can't go into the all the factors that help bring out why this was the case. But perhaps you might have heard about a book by Özlem Kumrular, which is called in Turkish Avrupa'da Türk düşmanlığının kökeni, the origins of enmity towards the Turks in Europe. And I met her. She's a very brilliant scholar, and I think this was her PhD dissertation in a Spanish university, because she knows Spanish quite well, and there are references to a number of Spanish sources. Even Cervantes was a prisoner once, you know, and all these things ended up creating the idea of a terrible Turk. And I've just seen your article, chapter 5 in your book, also bears the title Terrible Turk. And of course I read it tonight. Read it there. And but there were also some other reasons. For instance, well, he went to France, of course, first, and France was the right place for him. The first Crusades started there, and Pope Urban II, for instance, when he made his historic speech at Clermont in France in 1095, the beginning of the First Crusades, when he called on the Christians to wrest away the Christian sort of places in the Near East, thousands listening to him cried out, "Deus vult," God wills it. So, he had ostensibly God on his side. But this happened, this call happened in the French territory, and they came and fought mainly the Seljuk Turks, and they established good relations with the Armenians there in Anatolia, and trading agreements were signed between them. Cardinal de Richelieu authorized the Armenians to trade freely anywhere in France. And Armenian studies started in France. A certain review des études arméniennes also started in France. And some of the Armenians in Anatolia became Catholics, accepted the teaching of French Catholic missionaries. And they went and stayed in France. They became French citizens. For instance, there's a very popular French singer and artist, Aznavour, and he should be around 85 years old now. And he's quite well known and liked everywhere. And he keeps making a few statements lately, especially about this issue. And one of the things he said was that his mother was a Turkish Armenian, born in Adapazarı. And he said, if my father had not taken the family to France, I would have been born a Turkish Armenian. And now I'm French, and so on. So he's trying to start a new approach of some sort in order to find an eventual solution between the two peoples. And I think that it should be followed up, what he wants to say. But in any case, so some Armenians went and stayed in Paris, and there they established churches and chapels and clinics and schools and political parties, the Dashnaks, the Khunchaks, and the Ramgavars, and so on. And they established newspapers, journals, even before the First World War. So when Bogos Nubar and some of the other Armenians went to France, they felt at home in a sense. They were well received because there was a history behind it. There were good and close relations when the Crusaders were fighting against the Turks and the Muslims in the Near East. Now, Nubar certainly made use of this development, and he met Georges Clemenceau, for instance, who was a very well-known French politician, and had been prime minister and has been in other positions, and as well as a number of other French diplomats. He got in touch with daily papers and magazines and periodicals, moreover, I mean, in some of his writings to the Catholicos in Ishmiazin, he says that they are preparing certain articles which they expect to be printed the way they are, without any additions or subtractions, in the French press, and this is what had happened actually. He was very careful in describing France as the eternal protector of the weak and a magnificent dispenser of justice. He frequently made talks here and there under the auspices usually of the France-Armenia Committee. But you will agree with me that the Asians and the Africans will not join him in that kind of a description of the French Empire. He is the eternal protector of the weak and the magnificent dispenser of justice. He was just politicking, in other words. He wanted their support. Maybe he believed in it, but even some contemporary French historians will never accept that as a proper description of French history, especially since the 18th century. The Armenians were also well established in Britain, and they also had a British Armenia Committee, and the Armenians had friends in both houses of the Parliament, among the Lords, House of Lords and the House of Commons, and most importantly, Lord Bryce was their friend, and Bogos Nubar and several of his colleagues were very instrumental in the preparation of a book that aimed at the Ottoman Turks that was printed in 1916. You remember that book? I have a copy of the very first edition, which is very difficult to get now, but it's been printed over and over again. The young British historian Arnold Toynbee was its editor, and he had an Armenian to translate the Armenian stuff, and there are no references to. It's just like a book of gossip, as a matter of fact. For instance, sometimes it said, according to what an old Armenian lady told a missionary who was born in neutral Switzerland, such and such thing has happened. And of course, all these words are chosen very carefully. For instance, just because Switzerland happens to be legally and according to international law is a neutral country, that doesn't mean that every Swiss citizen shall be neutral. We're very far from it. And usually a reliable person, a gentleman from such and such European country and so on. This is not, of course, the way to write history, especially when the issue is so complex. There is entirely no reference to any Turkish source And when I was talking to somewhere in Europe, I'm sorry, somewhere in New York, I think in the year 2009, there was a young Armenian lady, an American citizen, who said to me, "Do you know what my grandfather told me? No, do you know what my grandmother told me? But you wouldn't believe that." And I said, I would believe them. I certainly do. You know something? There might even be things that she didn't have the courage to tell you. Well, go beyond what you told me. There may be certain things that she couldn't tell you, possibly. But what you don't know is, same things happen to some Turks and other Muslims. That's the crux of the matter. This is, in psychiatry, this is suffering from a complex of victimization. So sometimes the husband comes to a psychiatrist and complains about his wife, and the wife comes to a psychiatrist and complains about the husband and so on. And what the good psychiatrist would try to tell either one or the other is that, do you realize what you have done to the other one? And unless this is also brought into the issue, there can be no solution. And whatever has happened in the past, in history, actually, really, is so much different, what especially some of the younger Armenian generations now are told what has happened. There is no similarity between the two things. What actually happened, what they know that has happened. Now, of course, I said that Bogos Numar had some connections with Russia, and certainly the Armenian connections with Russia is also time-honored, not as long as those with France, perhaps, but especially after the Treaty of Turkmenchai in 1828, Persia lost some territory to Russia, and with it went the Azeri Turks and the territory that belonged to them as well. And Yerevan, which is now the capital of the Independent Republic of Armenia, was once, and not so long ago, a totally Azeri Turkish city. And Ercüment Bey here informed me last night, I suppose, that even in 1909, the Azeri Turkish population in Yerevan was quite a lot. But not today. Not a single Azeri Turk in Yerevan. Now, the Tsarist Russian policy was to remove the Turks and the other Muslims from there and to make it a Christian sort of a city, because they would have confidence in it. It's for purpose of security, so to speak. And naturally, many Armenians gradually and in time had a much better place in the Russian society. For instance, the Lazarev family set up a research center, which eventually became the Institute of Oriental Studies in Moscow. And that particular building, which he helped build, is now the Armenian embassy in Moscow. And there were some Armenian generals in the Tsarist army. Lazarev was one, Melikov, Sherkovnikov, and Tergukasov, and so on. And for instance, these people were very instrumental in the Russian victories during the Russian Ottoman War of 1877 and 78. This was the worst war that took place. We lost so much territory and so on. And of course, Armenian relations with Russia were not always very smooth because they had their own people who disliked the minorities, and they did not consider the Armenian Gregorian Church as a typical full-fledged Christian church. And also this is one of the sicknesses of the Western world as well. I mean, it was the Ottoman Turks who first recognized the Armenian Gregorian Church as an independent church. That was in 1461. And very few people know this, and nowadays there's no reference to it at all. Well, it shows some magnanimity and readiness to accept the others as well into the fold of the nation. Well, for instance, there was a certain Konstantin Petrovich Pobyedonostsev. He was an arch enemy of especially of religious minorities, and the Tsar in his time, for instance, was also his student. He attempted Russification, and that pushed the militant Armenians towards revolutionary activities, and finally they set up in Tbilisi, which is now the capital of Georgia, in 1890, a Dashnak political party. Well, it was not a political party in the sense that we understand what political parties are or should be. It was more like a terrorist organization. For instance, we know from the doctoral dissertation of the lady who taught this particular topic in the University of California at Los Angeles.
Nalbandian?
In Albanian, yes, Albanian. And she writes that it's very difficult to get hold of the original documents because they used to memorize the articles and then swallow them and so on, because even the article said that, well, our activities will be to shoot the administrators and assassinate such and such people and so on and so forth. Now, we don't call such a gathering a political party nowadays, do we? But they are supposed to be political parties. Now, they are terrorist organizations, and Nalbandian was one of the first few Armenians who described them as terrorists in the way they were. Well, of course, the conditions of the First World War changed things a little bit in favor of the Armenians, and Tsar Nicholas II promised them a brilliant future at the end of the First World War. He had just the opposite kind of a future in 1917, but nevertheless, he promised them a very nice future and congratulated them and thanked them for the support in the war against the Turks and so on. Well, he was not the only one. I mean, the Armenians got praises from the British General Allenby and Lloyd George and Georges Clemenceau and 116 members of the French General Assembly Parliament and so on and so forth. So, in other words, the Armenians had some sort of good relations among the Russians as well. So Bogos Nomar cultivated on that as well. He had, actually, he did not have confidence, much confidence in the Russians, because he always suspected that the Russians were after occupying Turkish lands, especially eastern Anatolia and turning it into a Russified area. In other words, they were planning to bring in Russian peasants and the Cossacks, and then changing the whole composition of the society there. And of course, they were trying to add the Turkish Straits to the Tsarist Russian domains. And there were enough enmity towards the non-Russians and the non-Orthodox people in Russia. And for instance, one of the governor generals of the Caucasus said that in the future, or in the near future, there will be no Armenians left in the Caucasus, save a few specimens for the museum. I don't think that this is a very friendly way to describe the future of the Armenians. Nubar also did not neglect Italy, and Italy had wrested away Tripoli and Benghazi from the Turks in 1911, and a year later they had established themselves over the island of Rhodos and the Dodecanese. There were 12 islands there. And Nubar knew that there was an Armenian community near Venice, especially in the small island of St. Lazaro, and it's still in operation. As a matter of fact, the first book in the Armenian language was printed in St. Lazaro. And Nubar, because of his connection with France, Britain, Russia, Italy, and so on, he felt free to discuss the Ottoman lands. And he assigned large tracts of territory, for instance, to France, to Britain, or to Russia. And he reserved considerable territory for Italy. And he didn't even forget Greece and so on. And for instance, as if he is some sort of an overall administrator in the world, he says, well, some territory should also be going into this country, and so on and so forth. And all of these territories were parts of the Ottoman Empire. And he also communicated with the Armenian Patriarch in Istanbul. And the latter, of course, was a citizen of the Ottoman state. And he confidentially informed the Patriarch that the British and the French would together attack Turkey's Dardanelles in 1915. Now, this is supposed to be top secret information. And governments usually don't tell it to others. And even in a single government, only 2 or 3 people know such things before it happens. But somehow, they had so much confidence in Bogos Nubar that they allowed him to know. And he wrote secretly and informed the Patriarch in Istanbul. The Armenians in the United States, of course, they were the newest among the diaspora communities, but the situation changed, especially after the 1830 Ottoman-American agreement, and missionaries came over, and the idea was to convert Muslims into Protestantism. It's not, perhaps the lady there who has written a doctoral dissertation on this, maybe she doesn't agree with me, but in any case, some of the things that I've read about it, but at least they did not know much about the Turks in Islam, did they? No, they didn't. No, we agree on that. All right. For instance, I know of a book written by an American Protestant missionary, a certain Williams, and an Armenian who was the president of the Armenian community in New York. together they published a book called Bleeding Armenia. And it was printed in a place like Chicago in 1896, 4 years before the whole world entered the 20th century. Do you know what it says?
I can imagine.
You didn't see that? It says the Turk is a wild animal that has to be caged. We beg pardon of the hyenas and the other wild animals to have used their names in order to describe a Turk. I don't know, this is racism, pure and simple.
Rejoined as
But yeah, and so I think that proves that they knew very little. Now, if I say, when I say that their relationship with the Turks and with the Armenians as well changed very radically after 1830. Now, the date of this particular book is 1896. In other words, 66 years later. So they didn't learn much in the meantime. They turned towards towards the other Christians, whom they thought were not really the best of Christians, in a sense. I mean, they probably thought that they should be, it's better for them and for everyone else if they embraced Protestantism and so on. So the French Catholic missionaries thought the same, and they fought over the Armenians in a sense. And the Patriarch in Istanbul came to the Ottoman Sultan and complained about them. He says, "What are these missionaries trying to do? I mean, they are members of the Gregorian Church." And of course, the Sultan sympathized with them and so on. But and afterwards, seeing that some of the former Gregorian Armenians have embraced either Catholicism or Protestantism, then the Sultan had no choice but to accept them as such. And then he recognized, on the basis of different ferments, the existence of the Catholic Christians and the Protestant Christians in his own state, society. And of course, not the Turkish families did not. They opened up schools, which started as missionary schools, and the first one was opened up, I think, in 1840 or something, in Bebek. So it was a small, maybe a 2-room or 3-room missionary school, and then it developed into a Robert College. And I graduated from Robert College, by the way, and so did my wife. But things that changed since then, naturally. But in those days, in the 1800s and so on, the Muslim Turkish families didn't send their children, boys and girls, to these schools because they said it's a Christian school. It's a mission, moreover, a missionary school. And Halide Edip Hanım was the first Muslim girl graduate of the American College for Girls in Arnavutköy in Istanbul. And and from Robert College, another person who taught us English and translation and so on and so forth when I was a student there, who became our interpreter and translator during the Lausanne Conference in 1923. And his wife was a deputy during Atatürk's time, by the way, and so on. They were very well. Well, in any case, so it was that these missionary schools were very popular among the Christians, among the Armenians and the Greeks. And of course, some of them were given preferably church scholarships and fellowships to come over here. For instance, Khachatur Oskanyan was one of them, and another one was Kardashian. Remember the three Kardashian sisters? That's the
Scholars?
yeah. They got
They come a long way.
they. Well, I suspect that there's something to do with the Kardashian who drew maps of greater Armenia and so on, and he got an American sign it, and then immediately that was sent to Washington for President Woodrow Wilson to see. His suggestions were in accordance with the principle of self-determination. But of course, in all these lands, the Armenians were a minority everywhere. But supposed to be an application of the principle of self-determination. Well, in any case, so the Oskanyan, for instance, he had his education in New York, and the City College of New York, and he wrote a series of articles in which he described the Armenians as the Americans or the Yankees of the Middle East, and so on. Of course, this appeals to the people, to the leaders in this country, and naturally they were good traitors. They had initiative. The Armenians are hardworking and so on. There's no doubt about that. But Turkish Armenian families came over to the New World some decades later, much more numerous, and they went to Boston, first to New York and then to New England, especially in Boston. They are very strong in Boston. Anyone, John Kelly, for instance, who was a presidential candidate, the first thing that he said was, I'd like to get the Armenian genocide recognized by the Congress and so on. He had to do that because there is a very strong Armenian pressure group in Boston. And he doesn't stand a chance of getting elected if he doesn't say that. And especially if you come from California, and Pelosi came from California, the Speaker of the former Parliament, the House of Representatives, for instance, she can't change her attitude. That would be a suicide, politically speaking. So in Fresno, for instance, in 1981, the Armenians celebrated their centennial because they had first come there in 1881 and so on. Of course, the person who made the Armenians very popular and likable in this country was William Saroyan. And although I don't have a copy of that book here, this was the first book that I published when I was 19 years old in Turkey. I translated William Saroyan's short stories, My Name is Aram, you read it, into Turkish and got it published. Now, when I appeared in the French court in Paris in 1984, he said, especially during the Orly trial, that was the second one in 1985, that was an easy thing because they killed a number of people, none of them Turks, and wounded about 80. And nobody came to support them because French blood and American was killed and so on and so forth. But the first one, that was a very tough thing. And we won it. Shall I say I won it? Because I was the only Turk there. Maybe that was too much. And they had attacked the Turkish consulate and restricted the freedom of movement, although of everybody in there. They killed a Turk and they wounded another Turk. So I was the only Turk that was called upon by the court as a témoin d'autorité, as a person who knows the issue. And there were 27 exactly Armenians opposing me there, with the same rank of representation, so to speak. And some of them were very important people. And of course, and in these trials, one of the defenders, the advocates of the Armenian side, who was a former mayor of Paris, he said to me, like every Turk, you also have a prejudice against the Armenians.
Oh.
He told me right away, right there, when I was talking. And I said to him, did you ever translate into Armenian the literary work of a Turkish writer? He said, no, why should I do it? And I said, well, I did. And when I was 19 years old, and of course I had the copy of that book, and I showed it to William Sarayan.
Oh.
I did that. So who has prejudice against whom? And then he sat down. And of course, really, some of my friends, of course, we learned somewhat good English at Roberts College and so on. We were very much interested in translating, first of all, John Steinbeck and Truman Capote and a number of others and so on. But William Sarayan for me was different, because I really liked him very much. When I read what he wrote, I said to myself, if I write something, a story, a short story or a novel or something, I like to write like him. And also he is one of my teachers. I mean, he changed my personality to a certain extent, because I was very much interested in philosophy and so on. For instance, at that time I believed, I think, in Platonism or something like that, and I wouldn't talk to someone who can't argue some philosophical concepts with me. But when I read William Sarayan, and I realized how small things in life, in everyday life, are so important. Because this man has a humanitarian approach, and the way he selects certain things that would look like unimportant to some others, and especially to me, for instance, how you translate this? And I did. And my family never said, do you know that he is an Armenian? They never said that. And my close friends never said that. When I took it to the publisher, what was his name? Varlık Publishing House, that was the best at that time. And he never said anything against it. He immediately printed it. So we don't have a prejudice like that. And so when the Armenians started coming to the United States, do you know what Sultan Abdulhamid II, who is generally referred to as the Red Sultan or something like that, you know what he did? He said that he took back their liberty of going to the United States. Now, logically, they might say, well, he wanted to get rid of the Armenians there. If you want to get rid of the Armenians, let them go wherever they want to go. If they want to go to the United States, let them go there. You can get rid of them just like that, without any bloodshed or anything. He wanted to keep them there, because they were his people, and moreover, hardworking people, and he expected to achieve certain things also with them. And the Armenians got in touch with the young Turk revolutionaries, and one of their conditions was that we'll support you, but you'll have to give us the freedom to go out and go to the United States and migrate there, as a matter of fact, and stay there until we die. And they promised them, and they did. And that bar, that hurdle, was lifted only in 1908. So, where is the innate enemy attitude of even Sultan Abdulhamid II? All right, then. And well, the First World War, just one or two words. France, of course, was not the benefactor of the weak people and so on. When the war ended, all of them added so much territory. Not all, but France added, and Britain added, and so on. And the Turks' inevitable concern was to protect whatever they had, and they couldn't do it. So we were the only ones who did not participate in the war for a dismemberment or a further dismemberment of the world. Now, I've also seen that Bogos Nubar, in several places, describes the Turks, the Easterners, and the Muslims as mobs. And so he hoped to rekindle past passions shared by the Europeans and Westerners, by the French, especially by the French, and so on. Now, what was the attraction of the Armenians as far as the Westerners were concerned? Now, this is a very important thing. The minorities were always attractive from the point of view of the imperial powers. Wherever they went, they picked up the minorities and tried to make use of them against the established traditional order. For instance, the French, when they, at the end of the First World War, as victors of the war, when they came to Syria and Lebanon. Syria was a Muslim country, of course, but the Alevis there, at that time smaller, but now about 11%, or between 9 or 11%, they picked up, the French picked up the Alevis. They opened the doors of the military schools to them. And so today's President Assad's father, for instance, entered the military college and became a 3-star general eventually of the Air Force, Syrian Air Force, and then he took power, civilian power as well, in 1971. But now a minority, the Alevi minority, is ruling Syria. And this is one of the reasons for the problem of today. And I'm very much worried. Of course, there's a dictatorship there. But I'm very much worried if they fall from power. There may be, I'm not saying that there will be, there may be a Sunni Muslim massacre, at least attacks on the Alevi minorities. Because they think of this as a revenge of some sort. But who is to blame for that? French imperialism back in 1919. Why did they do it? And Alevis are fine people. We have Alevis in Turkey as well. They are the product of that particular Anatolian cultural background. And they don't imitate, for instance, Saudi Arabia and so on. And I really like them and I love them. But I don't want this to happen to the Alevis in Syria. And there is such a high probability for this. And in Lebanon as well. The French supported the Catholics, the Christians there. And they left with to them a constitution that no longer applied to the circumstances of the 1960s and 70s, and the result was that there was a civil war there. Who is to blame? The French imperialism of bygone ages. And for instance, in Iraq, some people are trying to play with the future of the Kurds. And the British had done the same, and the Russians had done the same for their own purposes. And of course, in the meantime, there are also Turks in Iraq, and nobody hears about them. Mosul and Kirkuk. They had to leave these age-old lands of theirs now, where there was also oil there, as you know. Now, in Rwanda, for instance, the Hutus and the Tutsis. Hutus constitute 90% of the population, and the Tutsis 9%. Of course, there were some differences between the two for some time, but the Germans and the Belgians, before the First World War, they made use of that difference for their own purposes and planted the seeds of future bloodshed there. And then, in our time, we had the Rwandan genocide. Who is to blame? German and Belgian imperialistic expansionist policy of manipulating with the minorities there. Who is in power in Rwanda now? The minority, the Tutsis. They represent only 9%. And they're, well, the Somali Republic, 97% of the population is Somali. You don't expect such things to happen there. But there's a civil war going on. Why? Because there was a British Somaliland, French Somaliland, and Italian Somaliland. The seeds, of course, are in the imperial period. Now, it's very difficult to unite them, although almost all of them are Somalis. Now, the Armenian minority in the Ottoman Empire. The big power looked at it, not all of them, but as a minority that they can manipulate. And they were armed, and for instance, they even tried to assassinate Sultan Abdulhamid II in 1905. And when he was getting out of the mosque, the Sheikh al-Islam stopped him, and they had a very short conversation, and in the meantime, the bomb exploded underneath his royal car. And the driver and all the horses and the people around, they all died, but not the Sultan. But of course, you can't try to assassinate the head of the state. Well, he was tried and found guilty, naturally, the person who did that. You know what the Sultan did? He pardoned him. Now, there's something, very little is known about something that's very, very important, which we told to the people we met in the Congress building today as well, that the people here, or War, and even in Europe, don't know that the Armenians were belligerents during the First World War. They fought. The Japanese, before or after the Pearl Harbor attack, 7th of December 1941, they didn't even touch a weapon, but they were interned and put in camps. The case of the Armenians is just the contrary. They declared a war against us, and they, for instance, even in this book, page 84, there's a British document here. It's available there, by the way. The book is available there. In page 84, that's a British book that I got in London, a book that was printed in 2003. It's not just like any book on the First World War. It's the dictionary of the First World War, printed by a very respectable publisher. And there it says that the Armenians, quote, slaughtered, doesn't even say killed, slaughtered. It's a worse way of killing. Slaughtered an estimated 120,000 non-Armenians, while the Turkish army was preoccupied with mobilization, unquote. Before there was any clash in arms with the Russians. That's what the Armenians had done in eastern Anatolia. We are not talking about, and the British book is not talking about 3 or 4 or 5 people. 120,000. That's a lot, isn't it? Suppose the Japanese had done that. And the same with the Jews in Germany. They didn't touch a weapon. They only won the Nobel Prizes for Germany, because Germany was their country as well. Why not? Einstein had already won too. And but the Armenians said 120,000. This sort of corroborates with the figures that we have. Our figure is a little bigger, slightly, but let's accept this. And then it says, the same book, 2,500 rebels took Van in April 1915 and proclaimed a provisional government, and that the Armenian forces, quote, resumed control, killing perhaps another 50,000 non-Armenians, unquote. These are really big figures. In other words, I mean, this is something that the man on the street, in the street, doesn't know. They think that it was only the Turks who victimized a group called Armenians. And if this had been the case, it would have been genocide. But it is not. And you can't even, for instance, the French passed a resolution in their parliament saying that you cannot bring in, well, eventually, you cannot even mention the Turkish point of view. If you do, then you'll be put in jail for 1 year. And in order to pay the money that the court will ask you to do, I can't make the same talk anywhere in France. Well, of course, they abrogated that particular decision. But in any case, what they were trying to do was this. Now, we cannot agree to an Orwellian idea of creating truth parliaments. That runs counter to democracy. Political bodies are not the right places for passing binding decisions on historical events. And that applies, of course, to all parliaments. Yeah. Right. Well, thank you very much for reminding me that not only that, but life is short. Also, why spend it on this issue any longer? Well, they took over the city of Van, and they killed the people there. And there were two Americans, Captain Niles and Sutherland Jr., who had been fed, like many Europeans and Americans, with anti-Turkish propaganda when they went there. But they found out that the Turks could be only the victimizers. I'm sorry, could only be victims. When they reached Van, they saw that the 9/10 of the city was in ruins, and all of them were Turkish and Muslim houses. And the only places left standing were the Armenian houses. So who attacked whom? And so your ambassador at that time, Henry Morgenthau, wrote, it's in the National Archives, the Records Administration, College Park, Maryland, Internal Affairs, Turkey, roll 41, page 2. And it says 25,000 Armenians were involved in the Van insurrection. No one puts the figure at less than 10,000, but 25,000 is probably closer to the truth. Well, they also, in one or two sentences, now Bogos Nubar wrote on the several times, but principally on the 24th of July 1915, to the British general in Cairo, Sir John Maxwell, asking him to put on Turkish land in Mersin, the port of Mersin, 10,000 to 12,000 fighters. And if they do that, he says, it will be possible to rely on the 25,000 Armenian insurgents in Adana and its environment, in southern Mediterranean coast of Turkey, and on the 50,000 more to come from the nearby provinces. And he says this formidable force of close to armed 50,000 will be able to advance well beyond these borders and so on. And then he says that they can cut telegraphic wires, destroy railway tracks, blow up bridges, and interrupt the enemy's communication lines. The enemy is us. And the Turk will not be able to use their forces against us, against you as well, throughout winter. Now, this is not a normal thing to do for a man who was born in Istanbul. Isn't that true? And, well, perhaps the last point is the bigger Armenia issue. Now, there are one very important thing. Bogos Nubar and his associates were trying to create a huge empire, an Armenian empire, which Kachaznoni referred to as, he said this was a plan for an empire, and it was unrealistic. But right starting from the Caucasus, and then the whole of eastern Anatolia and southern Mediterranean, coming very close to the Mughal borders, taking in much of Antalya and so on. And when he mentioned this several times to the British and the French, some of them, the top high-ranking officials in those foreign ministries, you know what they said? But in none of these places you have a majority. when we win the war, we'll have faced lots of opposition. There'll be trouble. And they won't accept it, even in accordance with Woodrow Wilson's principle of self-determination. We are a minority everywhere there. And he says, I know. Well, what does that mean? On what basis then? So, well, there are lots of Armenian publications, for instance, Gabriel Seropapazyan, and I've published something about this, a small booklet. He's the author of Patriotism Perverted. It was published in Boston by the Baikar Press in 1934, and he says, as it is evident from Turkish, Russian, and other world statistics, and from the established social situation, we again confirm that there is no territory within the Ottoman borders where the Armenians form a majority. Yeah. Well, I told you that I can't touch upon everything of the issue, but nevertheless, I think I better.
But you're valiant to try.
I just want to say one thing before United thanks. This is an excellent book, Armenian Falsifications. This is so concise and so useful, and that's Professor Ataov's, I think, last book, isn't it the latest?
The latest, yes.
Yeah, we have it on sale, and the proceeds will go to ATA.
Well, we'll have to discuss it among ourselves.
So they are available here if you want to. It's an excellent book. That's what I want to say.
I thank everyone for coming this evening, listening to Professor Ataov. Professor Ataov, thank you very much for discussing this important issue with us. And we bid you well in your future endeavors.